Now, over the past few Wednesday evenings, we've been seeing the Christian life described as a race, requiring endurance and perseverance. There are all sorts of temptations and obstacles which could cause us to give up. And so, to spur us on, the author of Hebrews wants to excite us, to point us to just why it is so worthwhile to keep going. And in this chapter, he gives us examples from the Old Testament, a list of great heroes. And we've called it the Hall of Faith, this great cloud of witnesses. This evening, we'll be thinking about Moses and the Exodus. I guess Moses may be a familiar name to many of us, more than some of those heroes we've read about in this chapter. He actually came up earlier in the book, in chapter 3 of Hebrews, where we heard about a wilderness generation, those who left Egypt with Moses, but rebelled and never entered the promised land. They gave up on following the Lord. And so there, the author said, don't follow the unbelief of that wilderness generation. But here he's saying, do follow the faith of their leader, Moses. For St. Helens regulars, I know lots of our small groups have looked at Exodus recently, whether that's in a 6 p.m. or student Bible overview group, or at the 10 a.m. or 10:30 congregations last year, or IGG, or 4 p.m. the year before. But even if we have, I think we may be surprised by what Hebrews wants to include here. So I'm going to read the verses that we have, and then we're going to have a bit of discussion time to dig in to find out some more about Moses and his faith. Let me read. So the top of the handout that hopefully you've all got, or on page 1211. It's Hebrews chapter 11, starting at verse 23. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents, because they saw that the child was beautiful, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. By faith, he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. By faith, the people crossed the Red Sea as on dry land, but the Egyptians, when they attempted to do the same, were drowned. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. By faith, Rahab, the prostitute, did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. It's a remarkable description of Moses, isn't it? And I think it's fair to say that if I were writing this, it's not what I would choose to say. To begin with, this whole chapter has been an example of people trusting God in spite of what they can see. Faith is assurance of things hoped for, a conviction of things not seen. And yet Moses was famous for seeing quite a lot of stuff. In our small group this year, looking at Exodus, people were regularly saying, if only we'd been there, if only we'd seen all of that. And yet, the author of Hebrews spends these first 5 verses telling us about Moses' life before we even get to those classic Sunday school moments, the burning bush, the plagues. And then after that, it's just a whistle-stop tour, and we'll get to verse 28 later. But focusing on these 5 verses, I think it's fair to say, if our author here were pitching this as a screenplay for Hollywood, an alternative to Prince of Egypt, they'd have none of it. Where are those plagues? Where's the dramatic stuff? But I think that's precisely the point. When he gets to Moses, rather than talk about those moments, we get to see Moses' faith worked out before he sees God speak from a bush, before he sees dramatic plagues proving who God is. In other words, where Moses is a bit more relatable for us. And what's the big message we see from this hero, this example? Well, you've got it there on the sheet. Faith endures opposition. Confident God's reward is far better. Faith endures opposition. Confident, God's reward is far better. And we'll start with the opposition. I guess you'll have spotted some of these things in your groups. Even before Moses himself comes onto the scene, he's born in the midst of terrible opposition. The king's edict was a decree, a command to kill every baby born to the people of Israel. Pharaoh, the king, didn't want them to keep on growing and threaten his power, so he resorts to mass murder. But Moses' parents wouldn't have any of it. It's a slightly funny description. The word we have here is beautiful. They saw the child was beautiful, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. That's a quote from Exodus chapter 2. His mother saw this fine child. And here the parents have a choice between fear and doing what's right, between fear of man, of the king, and seeing things God's way. And so they choose faith. And they save his life, in spite of the great danger they put themselves in. And God goes on to use this boy remarkably. And that choice between fear and faith is the same in verse 20 as in verse 27. A choice between fear of man, of the king, and of seeing things God's way. Verse 27, by faith, Moses left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. Like his parents, Moses chose faith over fear. It's so easy for us to go the other way, isn't it? For fear of people, of those in power, like this Pharaoh, to drive all our decisions, to triumph over our trust in God and his provision. Last week I went to the cinema. It was a bit of a last-minute trip, using up some vouchers. We ended up going to see Inside Out 2. Now, I don't think it's spoiling it too much to tell you the basic concept. I hadn't actually seen the first film, but this isn't a big spoiler. The basic concept, you're inside the head of the main character, and you get to see all the different emotions working out, competing for control over her actions. And one of those key emotions, especially, I'm told, in the first one, which I still need to go and see, is fear. Fear's job is to warn them of potential dangers and point out things that could go wrong. Now, that's the job, and in its right place, that's a great thing. But sometimes, fear won't have everything quite right. It's good in its place. But here, our author tells us that some fears aren't worth listening to. Both Moses and his parents know better than their fear reflex. They know who God is, what he says is right. And so they endure in spite of the opposition of the king, in spite of the fear of Pharaoh. Faith endures opposition. And yet, if you're anything like me, I bet you can imagine making a different choice. Letting that fear of the king take over just a bit too much, letting it govern our decisions more than we'd like to, especially when fear doesn't see things quite right, when we forget to see him who is invisible, when our fear response of the people around us takes God out of the picture. And then there are the other bits of opposition he faces in the middle of that fear sandwich. We're told that Moses' decisions led to mistreatment and the reproach of Christ. So how did he do it? Well, he was looking to the reward. Faith endures opposition. Confident, God's reward is far better. And now for this bit, I've drawn up a little table there on your handout, a cost-benefit analysis. It's that classic way of making a decision, isn't it? Weigh up all the pros and the cons, the risks against the rewards. Sorry if you just come from a whole day doing this at the office. But the intriguing thing about this particular list is where the writer puts things. I don't know, could you imagine making the same decisions that Moses does here? So for Moses, he chooses to give up. He loses out on a place in the palace. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. That's what he loses, but what does he gain? Choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God. Mistreatment, that's his goal. Suffering with the slaves, suffering with the people of Egypt. And if you look at the first few chapters of Exodus, you can see just how miserable it was for the people of God at that time. And yet that's what Moses chooses, to identify with God's people. And not only does he choose it, but he sees that as better, as the benefit. I suppose he knows, thinking about verse 25, that there are two things in that verse which are temporary. There's temporary suffering as part of God's people, or temporary, fleeting pleasures of sin. Choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. Moses knows that two things are not going to last. He can suffer with God's people, which is followed by an eternal reward. Or he can, for a very short time, enjoy the pleasure of sin, which promises so much, but can't deliver, and in the long run is just not worth it. Oh, how about verse 26? He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. Again, it seems like he got it the wrong way round, but that's really what it says. The treasures of Egypt are worth giving up on. And instead, he doesn't just say there's a reward, but Moses actively chooses to have the reproach of Christ, to suffer in the same way as Jesus. Now, for us, that could mean suffering in the same way, and also for the sake of Jesus, for his name. I suppose for Moses, Jesus hadn't yet come along, and yet his suffering follows that same pattern as Jesus' suffering will, as we see throughout the rest of this letter. And why does he see it as better? Why? Well, he was looking to the rewards. Moses has, in the eyes of the world, given up absolutely everything. He was a royal prince of the biggest empire around. In a world where royal princes weren't just sort of minor celebrities like they maybe are now, they were the wealthiest and most powerful people in the most amazing empire in the known world. He had the world at his feet. If you've been to the British Museum down the road, maybe a good little summer holiday trip, if you're a teacher or you're at school and you got a long holiday and you don't know what to do with it, you could go there and you could see some of the treasures of Egypt on display. It's pretty breathtaking stuff, even thousands of years later, thousands of miles away. I think Moses was willing to give all of that up because he knows he faces a far better reward, a lasting one in God's eternal city. I guess he would echo those words I've got on the bottom of the handout, made famous by missionary Jim Elliot, that he is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. Faith endures opposition. Confident God's reward is far better. Now, I guess we can all see places where the cost of Moses' faith might look a bit like the cost for us of following Jesus today. And maybe that's as we side with what can feel like a tiny group of Christians at work or school or university. And maybe it's as we use our leave to volunteer to tell others about Jesus instead of a nice holiday. Maybe it's as we choose a less glamorous lifestyle than our friends or colleagues. It can be so hard to be sure if it's worth keeping going. And that's precisely the point. Our author knows that these struggles are just the ones that the Hebrew church were facing. And his longing for them is that they would keep on going. Turn over your handout if you haven't already. And let's have a look. There's a few verses I've got there from chapter 10. And let me read them out. As he's writing to them, he says, "But recall the former days when after you were enlightened, you endured a hard struggle with sufferings, sometimes being publicly exposed to reproach and affliction, sometimes being partners with those so treated. For you had compassion on those in prison. You joyfully accepted the plundering of your property, since you knew that you yourselves had a better possession and an abiding one. Therefore, do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward. For you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what is promised. This is the context for those who are reading these words about Moses. We can see, can't we? The people reading this face many of the same sorts of struggles as he did. And the call here is to keep on going, to press on and not giving up in the race, but going where those Old Testament heroes have gone before. Heroes like Moses, who was not ashamed to be mistreated with the people of God, not ashamed to bear the reproach of Christ. They, like us, have need of endurance so that they will keep on going and receive that promised reward. We said at the start that Hebrews' picture of the Christian life is of a race. Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. As it happens, by coincidence, this last Saturday I was running a marathon for the first time. Just to be clear, no, I genuinely didn't plan for it to be so close to this talk, although it is pretty handy. And to be extra clear, although I'm sure this is obvious, it was definitely not in Paris, the Olympics, although we did start while they were still going on. Now, I've done quite a bit of running before, but this was a real challenge. But the thing that really surprised me was just how much harder it got as the run went on. And now, again, this might not sound like a huge surprise to you, but I distinctly remember between about 5 and 15 kilometers out of the 42, it felt really nice. I was having a good time. Even at 25, I still felt all right. But coming back along, the last sort of 8K or so was far, far worse than I'd thought. I couldn't keep the pace that I'd planned and prepared for. It took everything to just keep going. And I guess those of you watching the Olympic marathons on Saturday and Sunday might have seen the same. Halfway round, pretty much all of them are still there, close together in one big bunch. But as you get later, you start to see people begin to drop out. They can't keep on going anymore. Well, I guess the same was true here in Hebrews, that they can't keep on going. It's probably true for us tonight. To begin with, the Christian life may not feel too hard. Even the hard things we do face, we're ready for them. But what the author wants us to be ready for is the long haul, not to give up, even when it gets tough and stays tough, and not to slip into thinking that maybe we don't need to stick with those other Christians when they're being mistreated, and not to give in to those fleeting pleasures of sin, not to throw away our confidence, which has great reward. I was reminded of the reality of this one weekend back in June. On the same weekend, I went to 2 different events. The first was a welcome home party for a friend who'd been overseas. Years ago, I'd been here in the youth group with them, studying the Bible together, making sacrifices for Jesus. But in the meantime, they had, over time, stopped going to church and wouldn't currently call themselves a Christian. And while it was really nice to see friends again, there was something really sad about that. That same weekend, I was at a reunion for the church that I went to as a student. It was a wonderful time, seeing old friends who are still following Jesus in many different places. And yet, even amid that joy, there was again a twinge of sadness, thinking about those who I'd known as brothers and sisters who weren't there, and not just because they were busy, but because they'd stepped out from the race and no longer facing the cost. Now, that might feel like a shock, maybe to the youth group, getting your A-level results tomorrow, or heading off to uni, excited about the opportunities, or not even at that stage just yet. Might even be a shock to others arriving in London over the summer, fresh and ready for that grad job. I guess for lots of us, if we've been here for any length of time, though, we probably can think of friends no longer here. Some, again, for great reasons, they've gone off to other churches. But others where you're not really sure if they're running that race anymore. Hebrews says, we have need of endurance. Keep going. And to help us keep going, he reminds us of that reward. on Saturday, as I was forcing myself to keep going, I did think of some of the things I had to look forward to. Some friends waiting there on the finishing line, the Lucozade and the packet of Snickers I had in my bag for when I'd done. This medal I knew that I'd receive, which is not amazing, but anyway, there we go. And most importantly, the kudos on Strava for finishing the race. It's great. Now, those things may not motivate you. Fair enough, it's not a big deal. But the one race which is a huge deal is the Christian life. And here we have a wonderful reward to look forward to, far better than this or any of those other things I was looking for, far better than even the Olympic gold medals for Tamirat Tola or Sifan Hassan this weekend, better than the very best thing that this world has to offer, better than any of the treasures of Egypt, better than anything that we could enjoy in this life. We can endure holding on to the reward. And as well as that, but much more briefly, our author gives us just a little bit more reason that we can be really confident and certain that God can and will bring about this reward. We've got it there in those last few verses. Faith relies on God, confident in his salvation and judgment. That's the dynamic of these 4 verses, 4 different examples, quick fire, rattling through the history of God's people, from the Exodus onwards. And these examples all show dependence on God as he rescues his people and judges his enemies. So we've got the Passover, verse 28. By faith, Moses kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. God's people, as they sprinkle the blood, rely on God, confident of his salvation for them and his judgment in the destroyer of the firstborn. And then in verse 29, by faith the people crossed the Red Sea as on dry land, but the Egyptians, when they attempted to do the same, were drowned. The people rely on God for his salvation, and they are confident that he, too, brings about judgment to his enemies. It happens there again in Jericho, verse 30. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. God's people would have looked like fools marching around the city. It was all his work. But in that work, God's enemies were judged. And even for Rahab, the most unlikely of people, her faith in God is what saves her, as she chooses to side with God's people and is spared from his judgment within the city of Jericho. By faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. She had sided with God and his people. And as she relied on God, she enjoyed his salvation. You can have a look at those references there if you'd like to. Maybe later this week in your own time, why not have a look to see some encouragements from God who brings about his salvation and judgment. The author wants us to share in the faith that these people had, their total confidence in God. Faith relies on God, confident of his salvation and judgment. He is the one who is able to bring about that reward. So do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward. For you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what has promised.